We're discussing the American Journal of Psychiatry. Let's be clear that ASD symptoms are not always related to ASD. That's the title of this. So the article goes on to consider the importance of social difficulty. The article goes on to suggest that looking at the importance of social difficulties only in the context of autism is doing a disservice to the many non-autistic people who experience clinically significant deficits in social functioning for various reasons. So as I said, it is possible to have a clinically significant deficit in social functioning and not be autistic, because social functioning covers many, many different areas. In autism, the issues tapped into is theory of mind, but which is said to be the defining feature of autism, and its deficit in theory of mind is said to then result in all of the other social features that you see in autism, which is basically the core cardinal features of reciprocity, non-verbal communication, perspective taking, understanding another person's feelings and so on, and relationships. That's the defining social issues in autism. Obviously, difficulties with relationships and reciprocity can occur in other conditions as well, obviously, so that's why a quantitative approach shouldn't be used, and you should look into the reasons behind the behaviour. You should look at the cognitive areas. That's why tests can be used, neuropsychological tests and so on. But they are the core social difficulties in autism, and then there are many, many other social difficulties which aren't unique to autism, and that can be found in many, many, many different conditions, which can also be clinically significant in their own right, and the person should get support. But it's a mistake to say that just because someone has clinically significant deficits of social functioning that they're automatically autistic. They might not be. Without actual testing, we cannot know. Autism should not be used to imply that complex issues of social consequences of developmental or psychiatric disorders all fall under one construct. And she also talks about this idea of late onset autism, which some people have talked about, which is a complete load of bull, because that's not possible. But basically, some people have speculated about something called late onset autism. I think they've done the same with ADHD, as though like some people saying it's possible to have late onset ADHD and stuff like that, when obviously no, that's not possible either, because ADHD, like autism, is a neurodevelopmental condition that is signs are present from a young age, because you're born with it. But when I say late onset autism, by the way, I'm not talking about those cases in early childhood where someone appears to be normal as a baby and then suddenly regresses. That isn't what is meant here. They're talking about where autistic features don't become evident until like adolescence or later. And some researchers have said that this is to do with camouflaging or masking, where say someone might mask their symptoms. There is actually even a bit in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the latest edition, DSM-5, which actually has a kind of, a modifier, which says that signs may not become apparent until the social demands exceed the person's ability to deal with them. I'm paraphrasing it, that isn't exactly how it's worded, but along those lines. And it is true, obviously, that as social demands become more intense, that can change how the person's autism is manifested, and maybe new signs will become apparent that weren't so evident when younger. However, it's not possible for someone not to have any signs in childhood. That is just not possible. Like, if someone's autistic, they're going to have visible, evident signs in childhood, and those signs are going to result in parental concern, teacher concern. They're going to be evident. I did actually come across one individual that was who actually said her mum, basically, when she got diagnosed, her mum afterwards expressed disbelief or something, because her mum basically said she was completely normal as a child. That seems rather fishy, if you ask me, because it's true that some parents might be completely in denial and stuff. This individual, by the way, happens to be highly successful and leads a pretty normal life and has a really good job and stuff as well. So yeah, I'm a little bit. Obviously, she has been diagnosed, so she is legitimately autistic. But I do sometimes wonder whether clinicians are using a little bit are being a bit kind of, over liberal in interpretation of a criteria for some people. I do wonder sometimes. But like I say, technically speaking, there should be very clear signs the person is not normal from a young age. I mean, it's going to be, a parent would have to be completely putting their head in the sand if they had an autistic child to think their child is completely normal, unless maybe the parent happens to be autistic themselves, maybe, and in some cases might be potentially there are some cases where the parent might be autistic. I would say that's unusual because it's quite rare to. Obviously, what I'm saying is that's the exception rather than the rule, by the way. As I've already said, most autistics aren't capable of having kids, but for the ones who do have kids, who are able enough to have kids, and there is a minority of autistics who can have kids and do have kids, it's possible, or maybe they're not necessarily autistic, but have like border autism phenotype or something like that, or have a very high degree of autism traits. So they're either autistic but are in the BAP group. It's possible that maybe they think that their child is displaying normal behaviour because it's normal for them. So there is always that possibility, admittedly. But aside from that example, I would say it would be pretty unusual for the parents to think their child is normal if their child is autistic. Because even if the parents aren't aware of autism, they're not going to think their child is normal. Those parents will have concerns, definitely. It's often the parents who have concerns before anyone else because the parent is with the child all the time. But yeah, certainly parents will have concerns at the very least, but also usually primary school teachers will be having concerns, because autism, you can't hide it. I mean, yeah, masking is a thing, but often masking isn't learnt until a bit later, depending on the child, of course. I didn't mask until my teens, at least not properly. I think there's a slight difference between masking and camouflaging, where camouflaging is more passive. But I won't go into that now. I think masking is a bit more active, whereas camouflaging is a little bit more passive. So emerging social difficulties could be related to psychiatric disorders, she says. So, for example, symptoms that increase over time could be associated with psychiatric disorders such as the emergence of anxiety disorders, depression, things like that. There's no such thing as late onset autism. That's not a thing. Even if a person does develop new symptoms over time, there will at least have been some visibility in childhood. The autism would have still been there, and it would have been seen. Even if the person was diagnosed as a child, the behaviour itself would have been visible because you can't hide it. And she also says here the symptoms increase over time. In this group, low levels of parent-reported social deficits in childhood. So in this group, the parents tend to say their child was perfectly normal as a kid. Low levels of parent-reported social deficits in childhood, suggesting that the increase in social difficulties is caused by something other than autism, like say a psychiatric difficulty. So that's that article. The other article, very, very briefly, because annoyingly I can't read the full article because you have to pay for it. It should be open access if you ask me. It really annoys me when you can't read the full article. It's just the start of the article I've read, which is called Implications of Applying Clinically Significant Impairment to Autism Assessment, Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, April 2021. So it says in this article that clinically significant impairment is an important part of the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 that sets a threshold for diagnosis. So you have to meet the clinically significant impairment part of the criteria. If you just have the symptoms, but you're not clinically significantly impaired by them, you're not autistic, you just have autistic traits. And bearing in mind, autistic traits is not autism, it's completely different. In other words, you're basically a neurotypical normal person, just at the extreme end of normal variation. You have to have clinically significant impairment. You have to be disabled, basically, for it to be a disorder and for it to be autism. Obviously, assessing the clinically significant impairment is open to clinical judgment, and so obviously in some cases it's very obvious, in other cases it's not so obvious, particularly at the borderlines. Clinically significant impairment, has to affect social, work or other areas of functioning. So of course not being able to maintain normal friendships is a sign of clinically significant impairment. Not being for the life of you knowing how to interpret if someone wants to go out with you is a sign of clinically significant impairment. Not having the foggiest clue in living hell how to make a relationship is clinically significant impairment. Not being able to have the executive skills to go out and work and socialise normally is clinically significant impairment. So obviously there are many different types of clinically significant impairment. They're just some examples. So that sets the threshold. it has to disable basically, or it's not autism. But it says here that the increased prominence of a neurodiversity paradigm and the social model of disability runs counter to the idea that characteristics of autism are fundamentally impairing. So the diagnostic criteria is becoming misaligned with the contemporary views of disability, and unfortunately I couldn't read the rest of the article because it was proposing several ideas about how that clinically significant impairment part of the criteria could be changed, and annoyingly I can't see what the proposals are. That is in and of itself quite concerning, because I have heard some advocates from the NDM actually arguing that they should do away with clinically significant impairment bit because they don't like the fact that autism has to be disabling or disorder. That is really worrying, because we're basically now just turning autism into like a personality quirk any member of Joe Public just because they're a little bit quirky could have. That is really deeply concerning. So yeah, it should be clinically significantly impairing, otherwise it's not autism. I mean, it should be a simple equation. Like, if I could have normal friendships, if I could have a normal relationship, if I could go and earn a daily living, and okay, I might be a little bit socially quirky, I might be like my brother, he's fat, got broader autism phenotype, got many, many traits, he's not autistic, but say if I was a bit like my brother, finds it rather awkward being around people, prefers own company, very retiring and so on, but can go out and find relationships and earn a daily wage. Why would I want a diagnosis? But there are some people in the NDM who are just like my brother, who are claiming they're autistic, and it's like so wrong. But anyway, thank you for watching.